Hello and welcome back to the Art of Argumentation PowerPoint. This is part 4 and it's going to take you through 2 skills. Firstly, identifying and assessing when an author uses a counterargument and how well they refute that counterargument, as well as assessing the use of evidence and examples in an argument. So let's begin by talking about counterarguments. This is part of the structure of many types of passages, not all, but many. So we've already discussed how to break down an argument, looking for the main conclusion, the intermediates, evidence, examples, or premises, but we also have to get trained on how to look for counter-arguments. A counter-argument is an argument from the opposing line of reasoning, but the author brings it up in order to disprove it. You should be familiar with this from FSA argumentatives in 10th grade, as well as if you've taken debate classes. So somewhere in the middle of your argument, you present the other side. However, opponents claim blah, blah, blah. This, however, is false because, so the whole point is to bring it up just to disprove it. But you have to keep 2 things very clear. The counter is the other side, one reason for the other side. And the refutation is the way the author, for my passage, goes ahead and disproves it. And that's what you have to assess, whether or not they do a good job of that. Counter arguments are done on purpose. The author planned them out, so they should strengthen the argument, but only if the refutation is strong. If they bring up a good example, if they bring up good evidence, or just a really logical premise that really dismantles the other side, that's a strength to the argument. However, if the counter and refutation is not strong, if in fact they assume something about the other side that's wrong, if they exaggerate, or if they're vague, they say something like, several studies have shown that this is false. Many experts agree that this is not right. When they don't cite anybody, that's a big red flag that their refutation is weak. Or sometimes they just dismiss the other side. They don't even really try to refute it. They may attack the other side and say the other side has no idea what they're talking about. They're stupid. They're unpatriotic to think that way. But they don't actually give a concrete evidence, example, or premise as to why that side is wrong. So in that case, the refutation ended up weakening the author's argument. Now, big warning. Although counters are very common, they are not mandatory. Some passages do not have counter arguments for a couple of reasons. One, maybe it's balanced. The author is not trying to prove one side or the other. They're looking at both the pros and the cons. What are the benefits and the risk of this new type of alternative medicine, for example? Now, secondly, another reason why there may not be a counter is because maybe the argument is not really about a debate if something's right or wrong. It's more about what would be the best solution to solve a problem. So if we're talking about climate change, for example, I think this solution would work really well, and I explain it. I'm not really going to counter it. That wouldn't make sense. So even though counters are very common, don't be surprised if you come to an argument without it for one of these reasons. Don't automatically assume it's weak as a result. So as with global so far, you can tell it's getting harder. You have to keep those things in mind and use your logic to assess. So let's practice this a little bit. First of all, it's always really important to keep in mind the main conclusion. So I put the main conclusion first, even though in this passage it was actually at the very end. It's about driverless cars. Thus, driverless cars are already a reality set to reshape our world, moved on by their huge benefits. So they're clearly on the side for driverless cars. This was at the end of the passage, and remember, I gave you the advice to look for it right away so you know what side the argument is on. Okay, so knowing that, when I look for the counter, I'm going to look for anything that says no. Driverless cars are not a reality and they don't have benefits. So I look through it, and in this paragraph, it says that in an Economist magazine about whether or not self-driving cars will be in the near future, 32% of people said no, they're not. That's the counter. A sizable portion of the population believe that driverless cars are not a reality. So how do they refute this? They then go on to say that these people who voted no are not aware of the fact that driverless cars are more than a possibility. You can actually buy them. And then the author lists different examples of the Google self-driving car and this big study it did, and other prototype cars. So the fact that the author gave specific examples is a strength to their refutation. Let's look at one that's a little differently. This is also about technology. This is about robots as caregivers, especially in the elderly. And the MC is that in Japan, because the aging population is increasing so fast, they're going to need practical and affordable robots to help senior citizens. That's the MC. I look through the whole passage and I don't see a counter, but I do see that the author brings up a deputy director of this company who agrees that the machines do cost a lot of money, and that's a concern. They're not trying to prove that wrong. They are expensive. They're hoping to make them more and more affordable, but right now they're expensive. So the fact that the author acknowledges that, they're not dismissive, they instead want to point out the fact that this is true, that's not a weakness, that's a strength, because it's showing that the author is objective, balanced, and they're not just being blindly biased one side or the other. So even though there's no counter, in this case, the fact that the author was balanced is a strength. So you have to look out for both types of uses of either having a counter with a strong or weak refutation, or not having one, but being balanced and therefore strengthening your case nevertheless. Now we're going to move on to talk about how to assess evidence and or the use of examples. Most passages make use of evidence and or examples, not all, but most, especially if they're an inductive argument. But even some deductive passages, as we saw when we practiced that, may have one or two pieces of evidence or examples. They don't have to have both evidence and examples. They could have one or the other. Usually there'll be a mix. This should naturally strengthen an author's reasoning, but there could be cases where if the sources are vague or none of them are sourced, or we can tell that the information has been manipulated, then it can end up weakening the author's claims. So we have to look out for that. And so I'm going to teach you a new app to learn how to do this. It's called SSAD, S-S-A-D. So Raven and SSAD will become the two main acronyms that you use to assess the source or to assess the use of evidence. All right, so let's go through it one by one. The first S is significant. So when they give me this percentage, when they give me this number, well, how significant is it? If they tell me that because of this new law, crime rates drop by 3%, is that really significant? Especially if I don't know the base numbers. So for example, if there were 300 robberies, a drop of 3% is not that much. Now, if I find out that the robberies were in the thousands, maybe 3% drop would be significant. So you have to look to see if the number actually proves in a significant way what the author is trying to say. Is it significant or is it insignificant? Next is sample size. This is really important when we have a survey or study. So I want to know who people want to vote for. I'm going to get a group of people, hopefully between 800 and 1,000. And from that, I'm going to extrapolate patterns about the population as a whole. There's no way I can survey everyone in the United States. But if I get a good sample, then my results within a margin of error will be pretty accurate. All right, so you look for that with surveys or studies. Anywhere between 500 to 1,000 is a good sample size. However, if I'm doing a psychological study, my number is probably going to be much less. It might just be 50 people, and that's okay. So keep in mind what kind it is. So if I have a poll of 850 voters, that's a good sample size. A psychological study of 55 participants, good sample size. I have a medical study and all I needed were records. I was able to look at 6,000 medical records, great sample size. However, sample does not apply when I just have a total count of people. If I'm talking about the coronavirus and how many cases there are right now, that's not sample size, that's just count. So sometimes students use sample size incorrectly. The A stands for alternative explanations. They're telling me this caused this, but are there any other possibilities? If there aren't, if there's no other trend, no other pattern or relationship that can explain why this happened, then it's a strength. If, in fact, though, I can think of, wait, maybe this is due to their diet, this is due to population increase, this is due to the economic downturn, or things like that, then that's a weakness to the study, the survey, or the sample. And lastly, details. That's really important. How were the people surveyed? What kind of questions were asked? Was the wording kind of tricky? Demographics are so key. Was there a good mix of the gender, of racial ethnicities, location? Did they just sample 30 senior citizens in one location? That's not really good, diverse demographics. So these are all the things you have to think about when you're looking. Overall advice, look to see how the information is visually represented. Did they try to make it 3D to make it a bigger effect? Did they play around with the XY axes? Look at that very closely. Is the Y axis actually at 0? Or did they start it much higher to make the distortions appear greater than they actually are? Percentages can be manipulated, so be careful. Did they round up the information? Did they just say close to 50% of people said this when it was actually 39%, Did they give averages, only totals? Raven comes into this too. Do I know the source? And if so, is the source reliable? Because if it turns out to be a biased source, I can't really trust it. And the word you really want to think about is the information representative. If I have a poll or survey, is this sample size representative of the population as a whole? Or do they not really meet the requirements of most people? If it's an example, even if it's one example of one case where this happened, does it seem true for most people in most places? If not, it's a flaw. So let's look at some examples. So here you'll notice that the one with the X, they didn't start at 0. So the differences that at first glance seem significant are actually really small and not that significant. Unlike the bar graph with the check mark, which did start at 0. So always look to see how it's visually represented. Next, New York City put out this pamphlet that said their new agency for children's services was great because they helped double the rate of adoptions. That sounds great, and it's coming from New York's own agency, so you'd think it would be reliable. But then when we do research and we look at the year-by-year numbers, the story's a little different. It's true that in 1996, the number was high and kept going higher, but by not telling us the specific year-by-year data, what we missed was there was an alternative explanation. There was already an upward trend in adoption rates, maybe because of the economy. That could be an alternative explanation. And what they also didn't say is that in the last couple of years of the agency, the numbers went down. So it seems like the creation of the Agency for Children's Services had very little to do with doubling the adoption rates. But they manipulated the information by just giving me a total number, by just saying, oh, they doubled, so that I don't really know the truth. So that's why we really have to do our due diligence when it comes to statistics, evidence, and examples. Look at this third example. They're saying that this speedy loss system will help you lose weight and improve your fitness. Your body mass index will decrease, that's the solid line, and your distance that you're able to run will increase. That's the dotted line. But when I look at the details of the study, they only studied 15 volunteers. And I don't know anything about the demographics. I don't know if all these people were young, so then this really impacted them. So the fact that the sample size is so small and the demographics are unstated, and I don't even know the source. Was the company itself the one that did this? Because if it's the company, they have vested interest to get the best results possible. So this is not a strong use of evidence at all. Now lastly, in your global paper, you're not going to have a chart. You're just going to have a passage. So this is about the caregiver robots again, and they have a lot of evidence, including the fact that the population of the elderly is expected to rise by 30%. This is coming from the Japanese government, so it's reliable, and 30% increase is definitely significant. Moreover, they're saying that caregivers experience back pains. 70% of them experience back pains due to constantly lifting the elderly. 70% is significant, and there really seems no other reason. There's no other alternative explanation for why they would have back pain. So this is all strong use of evidence. So that's how you put all of SSAD together in order to assess. Thank you for tuning in again.